The first bell dragged me out of sleep like a hand on my ankle. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, counting each slow, heavy ring as it rolled across the valley and pressed against my windows. Our church doesn't ring its bells at night. Not for weddings, not for funerals, not for anything. But there it was, that old iron throat calling out into a town that preferred to keep its eyes shut and its mouth closed. By the 12th chime, I was standing barefoot on the cold floor, the boards creaking like they remembered every secret ever whispered in that house. I knew my parents would say I was being dramatic again, that it was probably just the wind or a loose scare, or nothing at all. But as I stepped out onto the porch and felt the chill wrap around my arms, I couldn't shake the feeling that those bells weren't just ringing. They were pointing straight at me. If you've ever felt your own family's silence ring louder than any noise, stay with me. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next in my quiet little town. The first bell pulled me out of sleep with a sharpness that felt almost physical, as if someone had grabbed the edge of my dreams and yanked hard. I opened my eyes into the kind of darkness that sits heavy in the room, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. For a brief second, I wondered if the sound had been part of a fading dream, but then a second bell followed, slower and heavier, like whoever rang it struggled beneath its weight. I lay silent, listening to each deep strike as it rolled across the valley, pressed against the thin window panes, and slipped under the wooden bones of my house. By the time the 12th chime faded, I was already swinging my feet onto the cold floor. The boards creaked softly under my weight, a tired, familiar sound that felt almost like the house was reminding me it remembered every restless night I'd spent trying to move without being noticed. I walked toward the window, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Outside, the fog hung low over the grass, a pale sheet pooling at the base of the church hill. The steeple stood tall above it, a dark silhouette against the muted sky. The bells were old, their gears rusted, their ropes frayed. They should not have been ringing, not tonight, not at this hour, not without a reason. I stepped outside onto the porch, crossing my arms against a chill sharper than the one inside. The air smelled of damp soil and pine, as if it had rained earlier though the ground was dry. The night had fallen completely silent again. Not a dog barking, not a tree rustling, not a window shifting. It felt as though the entire valley was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice something that wasn't yet visible. I scanned the church in the distance, expecting movement or a lantern or maybe even a figure, but nothing stirred. Still, I could not shake the feeling that something had woken with those bells, something that had been asleep for a very long time. Part of me wanted to go back inside and bury myself beneath the blankets. Pretend it hadn't happened, pretend the world was the same as it had been yesterday, but that part of me was small compared to the quiet pull inside my chest. A pull that insisted these bells were not a mistake. They didn't feel random or accidental. They felt intentional, like a pointed finger tapping directly at me. It wasn't logical, and I knew exactly what my parents would say if I told them. Mara, don't exaggerate, you read too much into things. Not everything's a sign. I had grown up on those lines. Each one used to press my voice a little further down. I lingered on the porch, letting the cold air settle over my skin. The silence grew heavier the longer I listened to it. The steeple remained motionless, but I kept my eyes on it anyway, unable to look away. The fog curled around its base in slow waves, making it look like the church was floating above the town, barely tethered to the earth. The image unsettled me. For a moment, I thought I saw the steeple shift slightly, but when I blinked, it was still again. Maybe it was just the fog, or maybe the bells had already made me see things differently. Eventually, I went back inside, closing the door quietly as if afraid the night would hear me if I shut it too hard. As soon as the latch clicked, the house felt different. Not dangerous, not haunted, just aware, in a way I'd never felt before. I stood still in the hallway for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust. The air carried the faint warmth of the day before, and the familiar scent of old wood and lavender cleaning oil settled around me. Yet beneath all of that, something felt changed, as if the house had overheard the bells too, and was waiting for what came next. I walked back to my room, the floors moaning under each step even though I tried to move quietly. My bed sat where I had left it, the blankets crumpled, the pillow still indented. I sat at the edge rather than lying down, elbows resting on my knees, hands clasped. My heartbeat hadn't settled yet. It pulsed with a rhythm that didn't feel entirely my own. And the echo of the bells, though gone, seemed to vibrate inside my chest like the memory of a door slamming. I thought about waking my parents, but the idea felt pointless. They would have dismissed me before I finished the first sentence. They had always valued quiet over truth, composure over curiosity. Ever since I was a child, every question I asked, every observation I tried to share, every moment of excitement or worry had been trimmed down by their need not to draw attention. Quiet girls live safer lives, my mother would say, smoothing my hair as if the softness of it depended on how little noise I made. But tonight, my silence didn't feel safe. It felt heavy, suffocating, wrong. I exhaled slowly, staring across my room at the thin curtains swaying gently from the draft. The house settled with a soft groan, like it too was shifting beneath the weight of tonight. Something about those bells had pulled me somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. They had awakened a part of me I had nearly forgotten existed, a part that still wanted to know things, even if knowing them caused trouble. I walked back to the window, parting the curtain with 2 fingers. The steeple was harder to see now, swallowed by fog, but I kept my gaze fixed on the faint outline of its peak. There was no movement, no light, no sign, and yet, despite the stillness, I felt the same quiet certainty rising within me again. The bells had not been meant for the town. They had not been a mistake. They were calling to someone who had spent most of her life trying not to hear herself think. When I finally let the curtain fall back into place, a single thought rooted itself firmly inside me, a thought that made my pulse quicken and my breath catch in a strange way. The sound wasn't meant to wake the valley. It was meant to wake me. Morning came slow, like it didn't really want to commit. When I opened my eyes, the room was dim and washed in that pale, colorless light that makes everything look like it's holding back a secret. For a few seconds I lay there, wondering if I had imagined everything. The bells, the fog, the way the night had felt like a held breath. But then I noticed the stiffness in my shoulders, the lingering tightness in my chest, and I knew it hadn't been a dream. My thoughts were already reaching back toward the steeple before my feet even touched the floor downstairs. The house sounded like it always did in the morning, kettle humming softly, radio murmuring low, cupboards opening and closing with a familiar rhythm. My parents moved through their routines with the same quiet efficiency they did every day. If the bells had rung for them, they didn't show it. My mother stood at the counter buttering toast with calm, measured strokes. My father sat at the table, reading the local paper, glasses low on his nose, lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. Nothing in their faces suggested that the night had been anything but ordinary. "Did you sleep?" my mother asked, without looking up. "A little," I said, reaching for a mug. "Did you hear anything last night?" My father rustled the paper. "Wind was up," he said. "Probably what you heard." "I heard the church bells," I replied, careful to keep my voice even. "At midnight. They rang 12 times. My mother's hand paused for a fraction of a second before she resumed spreading butter. "Old buildings make strange noises," she said lightly. "You know how echoes are in this valley." "That wasn't an echo," I insisted, feeling that familiar heat rise in my face. "They rang." I counted. My father folded the newspaper slowly and finally looked at me. His eyes were not unkind, but they were tired in a way that pushed questions away. "Mara, you always let your mind run," he said. "You're sensitive. That's not a bad thing, but it can make you see patterns where there aren't any." The words landed exactly where they were meant to, right on top of my doubt. I'd heard them in different forms my entire life, polished by repetition, until they slid easily into place. Still, a small part of me bristled. If they rang, wouldn't someone else have heard them? I asked quietly. Wouldn't someone say something? My mother finally turned to me, a soft smile pinned carefully to her face. "People have work in the morning, love. Not everyone stays up thinking about every little sound the town makes. Don't start your day with worry." There it was, the gentle dismissal dressed up as concern. I let it pass, swallowing the rest of my questions along with a sip of tea that had turned lukewarm while we spoke. But even as I nodded and made the right small noises, my mind was already moving somewhere else, toward the grocery store, the post office, the library. Toward the people who moved through this town with their eyes open, even if they pretended otherwise. The day outside was bright in that harsh, clear way only small towns manage, making every imperfection visible. Gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked down the road toward the center of town. Houses lined the street in patient rows, their curtains half drawn, their porches empty. The church steeple rose behind them, indifferent and distant. In the daylight it looked almost harmless, just another old building that had always been there and always would. But I knew what it sounded like in the dark. I knew what it did to my heartbeat. At the bakery, Mrs. Carter was wiping down the front counter, her hands moving in practiced circles. I bought a small pastry I didn't really want, just to have an excuse to linger. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, Oh, like a stone, she replied, not looking up from the cloth. You not really, I hesitated, then tried. You didn't hear anything strange last night? Around midnight. She finally glanced at me, eyebrows lifting just a little. Strange like what? The church bells, I said. They rang 12 times, her face closed gently, the way someone might close a book they don't want to finish. Must have been dreaming, sweetheart, she said. Those bells don't work half the time. Haven't for years. But, she slid the paper bag across the counter and gave me a tight smile that told me the conversation was over. You take care now, Mara. Don't let your stories get ahead of you. On the sidewalk outside, the pastry felt heavier in my hands than it should have. I crossed paths with neighbors, nodded at familiar faces, tried the question a few more times in different places, with different people. A shrug, a laugh. A distracted did they? A quick subject change. Some genuinely seemed not to know what I was talking about. Others knew and didn't want to. The pattern was the same. Whatever had happened in the night, it had not happened here. Not officially, not out loud. By the time I reached the library, I was tired of my own voice. The library sat at the edge of town like a patient old Antwerp at the edges. Quiet, and full of things nobody wanted to talk about anymore. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, breathing in the scent of paper, dust, and old wood. The air was cooler in here, as if time moved a little more slowly between the shelves. Turning on the lights felt almost intrusive, like waking someone who had been sleeping peacefully. I slipped behind the front desk and started my usual routine, turning on the computer, checking the return bin, straightening the stack of community flyers no one read. The bells stayed with me, tucked just under my skin. For a while, the only sounds were the distant hum of the air conditioner and the soft thud of books being reshelved. Around mid-morning, Mr. Ellis shuffled in, leaning on his cane the way he had for as long as I could remember. He was one of our oldest regulars, a man made of soft sweaters and careful movements. I liked him. He treated silence like a language instead of a problem to be fixed. Morning, Mara, he said, his voice gravelly but warm. Morning, Mr. Ellis, I replied. Your usual seat. He nodded, and I helped him to his favorite table by the window. As I laid out the local history books he liked, the question pushed at me again. If anyone would admit to hearing something, it would be him. He had no reason to pretend. Busy night? He asked, settling into his chair. Not exactly, I said. Did you wake up at all? Round midnight? He frowned a little, thinking. Can't say I did. Why? I sat down across from him instead of drifting away like I usually did. I heard the church bells, I said, watching his face closely. They rang 12 times. It woke me up. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. There and gone again. He reached up and adjusted his glasses. That's not likely, he murmured. Last I heard, the rope to those bells snapped years back. Rusted apart. They haven't been used in a long while. Not properly. The room seemed to tilt slightly under his words. Snapped? I echoed. He nodded. Heard it from the pastor himself. They'd have to fix the mechanism before ringing them again. Costs money. This town doesn't like spending money on things it thinks it can do without, so. I swallowed. They can't ring, not by hand. No, he said. His gaze lingered on me for a moment, then softened. Sometimes we hear things that aren't really there, Mara, especially at night. The mind's a tricky little bell tower of its own. I forced a weak smile, but inside, something tightened. If the rope had truly snapped years ago, then what had I heard? Who had pulled on what? What had moved inside that old tower while everyone else slept peacefully through the night? Later, in the small break room, I replayed his words while pretending to focus on my tea. My coworkers, Jenna and Luis, drifted in one after the other, talking about ordinary things, groceries, car trouble, the latest small-town gossip. I waited for a pause and then slipped my question into the space they left. Did either of you wake up last night? Round midnight? I asked, staring down at the steam curling from my mug. Luis shook his head. I was dead to the world. Why, something happened. I heard the church bells, I said. Saying it out loud was starting to feel like pushing my hand against a closed door, hoping it would eventually open. They rang 12 times, Mr. Ellis said. The rope snapped years ago. Jenna laughed softly, not unkindly. You and your stories, she said. Maybe you just dreamed it. You read all those old mystery novels before bed. Your brain probably decided to have some fun with you. But it felt real, I said. It sounded real. Luis shrugged. Even if they did ring, it's not really our business, is it? Maybe someone was testing something. Maybe it was a glitch. Either way, I just let it be. This town doesn't love it when people make noise about nothing. That's the thing, I murmured. It didn't feel like nothing. Jenna gave me a sympathetic look, the kind reserved for someone who can't help the way they are. Look, Mara, she said gently, you know people talk. You don't want them saying you're getting Caught up again. Sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions. Just for your own sake. There it was again. The warning wrapped in concern. The same melody my parents had been humming my whole life. Don't draw attention. Don't stir the water. Don't be the one who hears what no one else wants to acknowledge. I nodded, more out of habit than agreement. And the conversation drifted away to safer topics. But as I stood later at the front desk, stamping dates onto borrowed books, Mr. Ellis's words kept looping in my mind. The rope snapped years ago. The bells can't ring. Not by hand. Not anymore. Outside, the church steeple peeked over the rooftops, quiet and harmless in the daylight. Inside my chest, that same unease pressed deeper, like a thumb against a bruise. If the bells couldn't ring, then what had moved through the night and made them speak? And why was everyone so determined to insist that nothing had happened at all? The sun was low by the time I started walking home, laying long shadows across the road like strips of dark fabric. The heat of the day had finally broken, and a cool breeze drifted through town, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and gravel dust. I took the quiet route, the one that curled past the church hill and cut behind the old cemetery. I wasn't planning to stop. I only wanted to pass by, see the steeple in the daylight, remind myself that things looked less frightening when they weren't wrapped in fog and silence. But as I approached the church steps, something shifted in the corner of my eye, a small, almost imperceptible sliver of darkness, where there shouldn't have been any. The heavy wooden doors were not fully closed. One stood slightly ajar, yawning open a few inches as though someone had slipped inside and forgotten to pull it shut. I stopped at the base of the steps, my breath catching in a way I couldn't quite explain. Those doors were always closed, locked usually. The pastor was strict about that, and the congregation even more so. Nothing about that building opened without purpose. The hesitation crept up my spine before I even knew I'd paused. I could almost hear my father's voice telling me not to draw attention, telling me not to look too closely at things that weren't mine to question. My mother's soft warnings brushed against the back of my mind like thin hands smoothing down my shoulders. Don't involve yourself, Mara, it only leads to trouble. Their old cautions pressed down on me with a familiar heaviness, as if the weight of every time I'd been told to stay quiet settled between my shoulder blades. But curiosity tugged harder. I climbed the steps slowly, feeling the grain of the old wood smooth beneath my fingertips as I reached for the door. The moment I pushed it open, the church exhaled a cold breath into my face. The air inside was damp and old, carrying the layered scent of aged hymn books, extinguished candles, and something else, something metallic, faint, like rust that hadn't fully woken yet. A sliver of weak afternoon light stretched across the entrance floor, illuminating dust particles drifting lazily like tiny ghosts. My pulse slowed and deepened, each beat echoing quietly in my ears. I took one cautious step inside, and the soft thud of my shoe echoed far louder than it should have. The church was dim, lit only by the fading light streaming through the stained glass windows. Reds, blues, and greens scattered across the pews in fractured, trembling patterns. The silence felt alive, stretching long and thin between the rafters, waiting for me to make a sound. I hesitated again, my fingers tapping lightly against my thigh, a nervous habit I'd learned to conceal around others. But no one was here to see, or if they were hiding among the shadows. The smell of damp wood thickened as I walked further in. I let the door fall shut behind me, though it landed softer than I expected. On the floor near the aisle, something caught my eye, thin drag marks stretched across the old planks, faint but visible, leading from the front row of pews toward the side of the nave. I crouched down and brushed my fingertips over one of the marks. The wood felt warm, as if something heavy had been moved not long before I arrived. A chill ran through me. This place didn't get much traffic outside of Sunday service or the occasional funeral. The idea that someone had been here recently, moving something large enough to leave marks, tightened the air in my lungs. Hello? I called, my voice quiet at first. It sounded small, swallowed almost immediately by the tall, empty space. I cleared my throat and tried again, a little louder this time. Is someone here? The rafters caught my voice as if weighing it, testing it, deciding whether to return it or hide it. No echo came back, only the soft creak of the building settling, a sound that felt too deliberate, too timed. As though it were responding instead of shifting naturally, I walked along the aisle, following the faint marks until they disappeared beneath deeper shadows near the pulpit. The old velvet runners draped over the stands smelled of mildew and dust, like untouched rooms in an abandoned house. My heart thudded in my chest with an uneven rhythm as I scanned the space around me. Everything looked the same as it always had: rows of dark wooden pews, hymn books arranged neatly in their pockets, candles half burned and forgotten. But there was a wrongness in the air, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers, curling its fingers gently around your senses until you realize something has shifted. I traced the edge of the pulpit with my hand and winced when a splinter pricked my skin. Pulling my hand back, I sucked the tiny sting, then looked again at the floor. No dirt, no mud, no footprints I could identify. But the wood was uneven in color, almost scuffed in places, as though something or someone had brushed through in a hurry. I imagined someone dragging a heavy object across the floor, their steps determined, their breathing harsh in this same quiet I now stood in. The thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I stepped around the pulpit and moved toward the back corner where the choir benches sat undisturbed. The air felt colder here, seeping through the thin fabric of my shirt. The quiet grew heavier, almost pulsing. I swallowed hard and spoke again, my voice barely above a whisper. If someone's here, I don't mean to intrude. Nothing. No shift, no sound, just stillness. I moved back toward the center aisle, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The longer I stayed, the more I felt watched, not necessarily by a person, but by the space itself. The church had always made me uneasy in a way I'd never been able to explain. But today, the unease felt sharper, more focused, as if it had noticed my presence and was deciding what to make of it. I turned toward the back and glanced up at the high beams above. Dust coated the rafters in thick layers, undisturbed for years, maybe decades. A single rope dangled from the ceiling near the bell mechanism, frayed, stiff, unmoving. It couldn't have rung the bells. It shouldn't have. Yet I felt myself staring at it too long, as though waiting for it to sway or shift without a breeze. A deep breath pulled itself into my lungs without my permission. I exhaled slowly, calming myself even though my skin still felt prickled with caution. There was nothing more to see, nothing I could explain, and nothing I trusted myself not to read too deeply into. I walked back to the doors, pushing them open with more force than necessary. Warm air spilled in, and I stepped outside quickly, blinking against the bright light. The world felt normal again, to normal. Children's voices carried faintly from down the road. A crow perched on the steeple's ledge cawed lazily. Life moved on, untouched, but as I stood at the top of the steps, I glanced back once more at the open darkness I'd left behind. The air inside still felt too cold, too aware. Something or someone had been there before dawn. Something heavy had been dragged, and the silence inside the church was not the kind that comforted. It was the kind that waited. And all I could think was this: asterisk, who moved through here before dawn? Asterisk. Dusk settled over the valley like a slow exhale, softening the edges of everything it touched. The sky was streaked with muted orange and violet, a kind of fading bruised light that made the world feel both tender and unsettled. I hadn't planned to return to the church so soon, but the unease from earlier clung to me all day, refusing to loosen its grip. Even while shelving books, even while speaking to patrons, even while pretending nothing had shifted inside me, a quiet pull kept drawing my thoughts back to those drag marks, that cold air, that silent interior. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, the feeling had become impossible to ignore. I found myself walking the familiar road with a steadiness that didn't match the anxious flutter beneath my ribs. The church stood ahead, its silhouette rigid against the dimming sky. In the evening light, it looked less like a building and more like a figure, stoic, unmoving, waiting. I felt a shiver crawl over my skin despite the lingering warmth of summer. The humidity should have hung heavy in the air, but as I approached the steps, a thin, unexpected chill wrapped around me like a warning. I paused at the base of the stairs, listening for any sound: a creak, a footstep, anything, but the quiet deepened instead, swallowing even the distant hum of insects. The church felt as though it was holding its breath, and I wasn't sure if it wanted me inside or wanted me gone. I pushed the doors open carefully. They moaned in their hinges, a long low complaint that echoed through the foyer. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dipped noticeably. It was the kind of cold that didn't belong to the season or the hour. The air felt still, as if trapped in time, as if the walls themselves were listening. Shadows stretched across the pews, long and unbroken except where a slice of dim light from the setting sun cut through the stained glass. The colors scattered weakly on the floor. Too faint to warm the room, I walked down the central aisle slowly, each step stirring motes of dust that floated lazily upward before settling again. My heartbeat thudded against the quiet. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, perhaps nothing, perhaps something too vague to name, but I sensed it somewhere above, somewhere near the rafters where the old beams crossed like folded arms. That uneasy awareness from earlier returned, urging me to look upward, to see something I had missed before. The upper balcony stretched along the back wall. Usually unused except during holiday services, tonight, it looked darker than the rest of the church, shadows layered thickly across the wooden railing. I climbed the small staircase to my right, each step creaking in protest under my weight. By the time I reached the top, the air felt even colder, almost damp. I ran my hand along the railing, expecting it to be smooth with dust. But the surface was uneven, some spots thick with powder, others wiped clean in irregular patches. Someone had been here, not long ago. I crouched, inspecting the floorboards. The dust patterns weren't random. There were smudges, soft, blurred footprints, or the faint impression of something being dragged lightly across the boards. My pulse quickened. This wasn't the same heavy dragging I'd seen downstairs. This was purposeful, almost careful, like someone moving with caution or trying not to be noticed. I straightened and looked toward the far end of the balcony. The frayed rope that once led up to the bell mechanism dangled from a rusted pulley near the ceiling. This close, I could see the fibers clearly, worn and brittle yet disturbed. Someone had touched it recently. The strands had shifted, tiny broken threads sticking outward like the remnants of a hurried grip. I stepped closer, reaching up to brush my fingertips against the fibers. They snapped easily beneath the slightest pressure. If the rope had been dead for years, who had been climbing up here, and for what? I lowered my hand and scanned the corner, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. That was when I saw it, something small and dark snagged on a nail protruding from the railing. I approached slowly, unsure whether it was a trick of the shadow or an actual object. When I was close enough, the shape sharpened into clarity, a scrap of fabric, torn, edges frayed, caught as though someone had brushed past too quickly to notice. I reached out and freed it carefully. The material was smooth, almost silky beneath my fingers, but worn from time or use. A dark color, black or deep navy, impossible to tell in this light. For a moment, I simply held it, feeling its weight or lack of interest in my palm. It was nothing and yet, something, a clue or a coincidence, a thread in a story I hadn't yet learned to unravel. As I stood there, clutching the small fabric piece, a strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like recognition, like this scrap belonged to something familiar, something connected to the sound of those midnight bells. It was irrational, maybe, but the sensation rooted deeply, settling into the space behind my ribs. I closed my fingers around the cloth, feeling its uneven texture press gently against my skin. I whispered, "Who are you?" before I realized I'd spoken aloud. My voice floated upward and was swallowed instantly by the rafters. The silence answered nothing, not a creak, not a shift, not even the faint echo of my own words returning. It was like the church consumed every sound I made, keeping it for itself. I stood still, listening for the stirring of movement, for breath that wasn't mine, for the faintest sign that someone else had been here not long ago. But the quiet held firm. The only sound was the soft rustle of the fabric between my fingers as I lowered my hand. Pocket it. Some instinct urged, take it before it disappears again. I didn't argue with the thought. I slipped the scrap into my pocket, the weight of it barely noticeable but the meaning of it impossibly heavy. When I stepped back toward the staircase, the floor creaked beneath me with a long, mournful sigh, as if the building could feel what I carried now and didn't approve. As I descended the stairs, the light from the front doors grew weaker. Evening had shifted into early night, and the cool blue darkness outside pressed against the stained glass in wide, muted waves. The church's chill followed me to the exit, nipping at my heels like a warning. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt warmer, softer, easier to breathe. I closed the doors behind me, but even then, a faint tremor worked its way down my spine. Walking home, the fabric in my pocket felt like it hummed faintly against my leg, as though holding a memory I hadn't discovered yet. And though I couldn't explain why, one question stayed with me, trailing me all the way down the hill, refusing to fade into the darkening sky. Why did that small scrap of fabric feel like it was meant for me? The next morning broke with a sharp, pale light, the kind that slips through curtains before you're ready for it. I lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet the restlessness that had followed me through the night. The scrap of fabric lay on my bedside table, folded into a small, dark square. Every time I looked at it, a quiet pressure stirred in my chest as if it were a question I hadn't learned how to answer. By midday, the feeling had grown heavy enough that I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the one place I'd been trying not to return to. If anyone could confirm what I'd experienced or at least give shape to the vague dread growing inside me, it should have been my parents. Should have been, but history told another story. Still, I found myself walking the familiar gravel path toward their house, hoping for something different this time. The house looked the same as always. Trimmed hedges, polished windows, curtains drawn just enough to let in light but not enough for anyone to see inside. It had always struck me as a place that wanted to be perfect more than lived in. I stood at the door for a breath longer than necessary before knocking. My mother opened it with her usual soft smile, a smile that never reached her eyes but always performed well enough for the world. She brushed a hand over my arm as I entered, not as affection, but as a gesture that pressed lightly, almost unconsciously guiding me to fall back into the version of myself that fit their comfort. "You're here early," she said as she returned to the kitchen. "Did you eat? You look pale." "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice felt smaller than I wanted it to be. "I just wanted to talk about something." My father sat at the dining table, glasses low on his nose as he reviewed paperwork with quiet concentration. He didn't look up when I entered, but I saw the slight tightening around his jaw, the preemptive bracing that always appeared when he sensed I had something on my mind. I sat across from him, feeling the old ache settle into its familiar place beneath my ribs. "I heard the church bells the other night," I began. Around midnight, my mother stirred her tea, the spoon clinking softly against the porcelain. "Mara, not this again," she said gently. "You worry too much. I told you before, old buildings make noise. You hear them as something more." "It wasn't just noise," I insisted. "They rang 12 times. I counted." She shook her head, offering a practiced smile that smoothed over the conversation like a soft cloth wiping away a spill. "Sweetheart, you imagine things when you're anxious. You always have." I felt the words sink into me in the same old way, quiet but heavy. "I'm not imagining this," I said, leaning forward slightly. "Someone moved through the church. I saw marks on the floor. The doors were open. And the balcony." My father finally set down his pen with a controlled exhale. "Mara," he said, voice level but cold at the edges, "what did we tell you about looking for problems where there are none?" "I'm not looking for problems," I protested. "I'm trying to understand what's happening." "What's happening," he replied firmly, "is that you're making something out of nothing again. You've always had a tendency to do that, and it has caused trouble more than once. People talk, Mara, they notice when someone stirs things up." A familiar heat crept up my throat, though I wasn't sure if it was anger or shame. "This isn't stirring things up. I'm telling you what I saw, and I'm telling you," he said, adjusting his glasses, to let it go. My mother's voice softened even further, the way it always did when she tried to guide me back into silence. "You embarrassed us once before, remember? With that teacher. With the mistake you thought you found in that school report. It turned into a whole mess for no reason." "It wasn't for no reason," I said quietly. "I was right, but it didn't matter," she replied, her smile tightening. "What mattered is how it looked. People don't forget things like that. This town is small. You know that better than anyone." The ache in my chest grew sharper, pressing against the years-old memory of learning that being right was less important than being obedient. I looked at my parents sitting there, my father rigid, my mother composed, and realized nothing I said would reach them. They had built their lives around silence, shaping themselves to fit within the narrow margins of this town's expectations. They feared anything that drew attention, anything that might hint their world wasn't as controlled as they wanted it to be. "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone," I whispered. My father sighed, picking up his pen again. "Then stop asking questions that make people look at us." The room felt smaller then, as though the walls had inched closer while I wasn't watching. The scrape of my chair against the floor sounded too loud when I stood. My mother reached out as if to touch my arm, but her hand paused halfway, hovering in the air before falling back to her side. "Mara," she said softly, "we just want you to live quietly. For your own good, for your own good." The words settled into me like stones. "I hear you," I said, though in truth, I didn't, not in the way they wanted. I gathered my bag and moved toward the door. They said nothing more as I left. The quiet closed around me the moment the door clicked shut, thick enough to feel against my skin. I walked down the path slowly, letting the gravel crunch beneath my shoes. With each step, an old ache spread through me, not new pain, but a familiar reminder of all the times my voice had gone unheard in that house. All the times I'd learned to swallow my thoughts before they reached the air. At the end of the driveway, I stopped and looked back at the house, neat, contained, perfectly arranged, just as it always had been. A place built on silence, maintained by it, protected by it. The same silence I felt spreading through the rest of the town. The same silence I'd heard in the bakery, the library, the streets. It was all cut from the same cloth, a fabric woven so tightly with fear and reputation that no sound could pass through without being reshaped or ignored. Why did they fear attention so deeply? Why did the whole town? And why did I feel, more strongly than ever, that their silence was not meant to protect me at all? The library felt unusually quiet when I returned that afternoon, the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe but settles on the skin with a faint sense of warning. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the familiar scent of old pages and worn carpet. I paused just inside the doorway, letting the silence stretch for a moment. After the conversation with my parents, I had hoped the library might offer its usual refuge, a place where the noise inside my mind could soften into something manageable. But today even the walls felt like they were listening. The heaviness from the church, from the unanswered questions, followed me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I moved through the aisles with deliberate calm, straightening chairs, checking return bins, performing the kind of quiet tasks that usually brought me comfort. Yet every sound today felt sharper: the faint hum of the air conditioner, the soft tap of a book spine settling on a shelf, the distant groan of the building expanding in late afternoon heat. I was halfway through shelving a stack of new returns when I heard it. A soft shuffle, followed by the distinct rustle of paper. The sound drifted from the back of the library, from a room that rarely saw visitors, the archive room. I stopped mid-step. The archive room held decades of old records, bound ledgers, town registers, outdated newspapers, and boxes of forgotten documents. Most people didn't even know how far back it went. When I'd been younger, it was the place I escaped to when the world felt too loud, a sanctuary of dust and quiet stories. But no one went there now. Not patrons, not volunteers, not even staff unless they had a specific reason. Hearing movement inside it felt immediately unusual. I set the stack of books down and walked slowly toward the back hallway. My shoes made barely a sound against the carpet, but the closer I got, the more intensely the air seemed to change, warmer, thicker, as if someone had been standing in that cramped room long enough to stir the dust. When I reached the doorway, I hesitated before pushing it open. The faint scent of old wood polish drifted out, mingled with something else, a cologne I didn't recognize. Inside, a tall man stood with his back to me, shoulders squared slightly toward the shelves. His posture was tense in a way that suggested he wasn't supposed to be there, though he tried to look like he was. He held a large leather-bound ledger open in his hands, flipping through the brittle pages with an urgency that didn't match the slow, delicate care of casual research. For a moment, I simply watched him, trying to understand what he was searching for or what he expected to find. "Can I help you with something?" I asked gently, stepping into the doorway. He startled violently. The ledger snapped shut between his fingers like a trap closing, and he took a full step back before he caught himself. His eyes, dark, unsettled, landed on me with a flicker of something I couldn't place. It wasn't fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something he didn't want me to see. "Oh," he said, forcing a strained smile. "I didn't hear anyone else come in." "You're in the archive room," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "It's not off limits, but people don't usually go in without asking." "Those books are fragile," he nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. I'm doing some research." "For a project?" "What kind of project?" I asked, watching the way he held the ledger. "Protective, almost defensive, local history," he said, the answer rolling off his tongue too easily. "I'm passing through town. Thought I'd look into some of the old church records." "Fascinating stuff, really." He avoided my eyes as he spoke, focusing instead on sliding the ledger back into its empty place on the shelf. The movement was careful, but I noticed the way his fingers trembled slightly before he let go. Something about him didn't sit right. People researching local history usually walked in with notebooks, cameras, questions. This man had none of those things, only a restless tension clinging to him like static. "The church records," I repeated. "Those haven't been touched in years." He paused for just a second, so small most people wouldn't have caught it, but his shoulders tightened before he turned back toward me. "Old things hold stories," he said. "Sometimes the ones people forget to tell." His words sent a thin chill down my spine. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, like he already knew the story he was looking for, like he had been waiting for it. He gave a stiff nod and brushed past me toward the hallway. As he walked away, I noticed something fall from the inner pocket of his jacket, a small folded piece of paper that fluttered to the floor silently. He didn't notice. Or if he did, he pretended not to. By the time I bent to pick it up, he was already halfway down the aisle, moving with a briskness that didn't match his earlier calm, I straightened and looked after him, the note resting light and warm in my palm. He didn't look back. The front door chimed softly as he left, the sound swallowed quickly by the old building. For a long moment, I stood frozen in the quiet, listening to the echo fade until it dissolved into the same heavy silence that had followed me all day. When I finally unfolded the note, my breath caught somewhere between my ribs. It wasn't a receipt or a stray reminder or anything ordinary a passing researcher might carry. It was a torn page, yellowed at the edges, ink faded but legible. A list of names from an old church roster, each name neatly written, each one belonging to someone from decades ago. Except one. One name had been scratched out with such force that the paper had torn slightly beneath the stroke of whatever pen or knife had been used. Violent, deliberate, as if someone had wanted to erase not just the name but the person behind it. My fingertips trembled as I traced the torn edge. The unease in my chest grew heavier, colder, sharper. That stranger hadn't come to browse. He hadn't come for curiosity. He had come for this. For the scratched-out name. For whatever story the church and this town had buried deep enough to pretend it never existed. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. Still staring at the door the stranger had walked through moments ago, the faint echo of his footsteps seemed to linger on the air, like a whisper that hadn't quite finished speaking. What truth hid inside that abandoned note? I sat alone at the front desk long after the stranger had gone, the folded note burning like a small, hidden ember inside my pocket. The library felt unnaturally quiet around me, as if every book on every shelf had leaned in closer, waiting to see what I would do next. I pulled the note out slowly, smoothing its creased edges against the surface of the desk. The yellowed paper was thin, worn soft with age, but the ink, though faded, was still legible. A list of names written in a formal, almost elegant hand. Names of people who must have filled the church pews decades ago. Names I'd heard in passing my entire life. Surnames that traced old family lines through this town like threads. All except one. One name sat violently defaced, ink gouged across the page in hard strokes until the paper tore. Not just crossed out but destroyed. I stared at the jagged letters beneath the mess of ink. Enough remained visible that I could make out the faint curve of two initials embroidered into the fabric scrap I had found in the rafters. My breath stilled inside my chest. The torn name on the page and the initials on the scrap matched. That realization pressed like a cold hand against my spine. I didn't know who the person was, not yet, but someone had gone to great lengths to erase them. Someone had wanted them gone from the records, gone from the church, gone from memory. And if the stranger had come searching for the same name, then whatever story was buried here hadn't been forgotten entirely. It had only been hidden. With a steadying breath, I slipped the note into my pocket and walked toward the archive room. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. Dust drifted lazily in the beam of afternoon light that filtered through the small window high above the shelves. I stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering myself. Then I moved forward, purpose settling into my steps with a confidence I hadn't felt before. The archive room stretched deeper than it looked from the outside. Shelves lined with brittle-bound ledgers and boxes wrapped in twine ran along the walls. Some sections were so worn the labels had faded to almost nothing. I moved slowly, running my fingers along the spines of the books until I reached the section where the stranger had been standing. He had placed the ledger back with such haste that it stood slightly crooked compared to the others. I pulled it out carefully and set it on the table near the back of the room. When I opened the ledger, dust puffed into the air, swirling briefly before settling again. The pages crackled faintly under my fingertips. Pew rosters, donation lists, meeting notes, weddings, funerals, those familiar records of church life documented meticulously year after year. I skimmed through the columns, the names recurring with comforting predictability. Old families, recognizable lines. I scanned for the initials I'd seen on the torn note. It took longer than I expected, but finally, several pages in, the name appeared clear, precise, untouched by ink or damage. My eyes lingered on the letters. Same initials as the fabric scrap. Same position on the roster. A person who once sat among the everyday lives of this town. A person who belonged here. I flipped to the next year. The name appeared again. And the next. And the next. A steady presence through the late autumns of this church's past. But then, abruptly, the name stopped. 1 year it existed. The next it didn't. No explanation. No additional notes on the margins. No record of moving away, marrying, or dying. Nothing. Just silence where presence used to be. A chill threaded through me. I tried the church meeting notes, the event logs, the baptism records, all housed in boxes stacked along the back wall. I pulled each one down, some falling apart in my hands, others still firm with age. Each time the result was the same. The name existed clearly until it didn't, erased without comment, removed without reason. I sat down at the narrow wooden table, the pile of records spread across it like fragile pieces of a puzzle. My fingers brushed over the old paper, but the weight that settled in my chest wasn't from dust or history. It was from the unmistakable feeling that I had crossed a threshold. The more I uncovered, the more I felt as though some group, some force had worked hard to ensure this story was never stitched back together. The stranger, the scratched out name. The torn scrap of fabric. The bells ringing. After decades of silence. It all pointed towards something deliberate. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to piece together what I knew. The town didn't like questions. My parents didn't like them even more. And now, the archives themselves showed me the same pattern. The moment something uncomfortable surfaced, it was buried, hidden, forgotten. Not for accuracy, not for preservation, for silence. I opened my eyes and looked again at the ledger where the name had once appeared. The empty space where it should have been the following year felt louder than any entry on the page. A quiet dread formed low in my stomach, spreading slowly outward. I lifted the fabric scrap from my pocket and laid it next to the torn note. The initials were unmistakable. They belonged together. Whoever this person was, they had left a trace into different places, one tucked in a church ledger, another hidden in a piece of clothing snagged in the rafters. I traced the embroidered initials with my fingertip. They were stitched with careful, practiced hands. Someone had once cared enough to sew them. Someone had worn this fabric close to their skin. And someone else had tried very hard to make sure I never learned who they were. The door to the archive room shifted slightly behind me, though no one was there. The building creaked often, but this sound felt different, intentional, almost like the room itself had inhaled sharply. I gathered the records into a neat stack, returning them gently to their shelves. My fingers trembled slightly, though I couldn't tell if it was fear or certainty. As I stood in the quiet of the archives, dust settling once more around me, I felt an old truth I had always known settle heavily in my bones. This town was built on silence, not peaceful silence, protective silence, and silence like that always existed for a reason. The note in my pocket felt heavier than paper. The fabric scrap felt heavier than cloth. The erased name weighed more than ink ever could. Why had this person been removed so completely? Why had the town chosen to forget them? And why did I feel, with increasing certainty, that whatever truth lay buried here was meant to find me? By the time the sun slipped behind the hills, the sky had turned the color of cooled ash. The streets were mostly empty, porch lights blinking on one by one like cautious eyes. I walked with my hands in my pockets, feeling the worn press of paper and fabric against my fingers as I traced the path I knew too well now. The curve of the road, the slow rise of the hill, the shadow of the steeple growing taller with every step. I told myself I could still turn back, that I could go home, pretend none of this belonged to me. But my feet kept moving, pulled by something deeper than logic, something that felt like recognition. The church rose ahead, dark against the dim sky, its steeple cutting a clean, severe line into the fading light. From a distance it looked lifeless, just another tired building that had watched over this town too long. Up close, it felt different, alive, watchful. The closer I came, the more the air cooled around me, the summer warmth thinning as though I'd walked into another season entirely. My breath came out in a faint cloud as I climbed the stone steps, the sound of my shoes soft against the worn edges. For a brief second, I stood there, hand resting on the door handle, feeling the echo of my parents' warnings press against the back of my mind. Don't draw attention, don't ask questions, don't go looking for what was buried on purpose. Then I pushed the door open anyway. The interior greeted me with a sudden hush, one that felt heavier than the simple absence of sound. It was the same damp, old cold that had settled over me before, but sharper now, almost alert. The last threads of twilight seeped through the stained glass windows in muted colors, turning the pews into long dark shapes. I stepped inside and let the door fall closed behind me. The faint thud echoed upward, swallowed quickly by the high ceiling and the shadowed beams above. It felt as though the whole building had turned its attention toward me, quiet and expectant. I moved down the central aisle with slow, steady steps, the boards underfoot complaining in low creaks. The smell of dust and wax wrapped around me, familiar but edged with something else tonight, a faint metallic hint, like old iron after rain. My eyes adjusted gradually, filling in the lines of the pulpit, the organ pipes, the balcony railing. Up there, above the main floor, the bell tower entrance waited. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth was, I had never actually climbed that far before. Growing up, the tower might as well have been another world. It belonged to adults, to caretakers, to people trusted with keys. Not to someone like me, taught to move quietly on the ground. The narrow door to the tower stairs sat tucked behind the pulpit, almost disguised by the shadows. When I reached it, my pulse had settled into a slow, insistent thud. I rested my palm against the wood for a moment, feeling the cool surface beneath my skin. Then I turned the handle. It gave way with only a small resistance, as if it had been opened recently. Its hinges worked free from their old stiffness. The thought made my throat tighten. I slipped inside and pulled the door gently behind me, shutting out the last of the colored light. The staircase was steep and close, the air crowded with old dust and the smell of dry wood. Each step groaned under my weight, a drawn-out sound that seemed to travel both up and down at once. The walls hugged me on either side, rough beneath my fingertips. This was not a space designed for comfort. It was functional, narrow, meant only to be passed through by those with a purpose. I moved carefully, one hand dragging along the banister, the other pressed against my side where the note and fabric rested like small, unsteady anchors. Halfway up, I paused to catch my breath. The quiet here was different from the silence of the sanctuary below. It felt denser, like it had pooled here over years of neglect. Somewhere above, faintly, something shifted, a soft, dry scrape that could have been a settling beam or something brushing against old stone. I looked up into the dim shaft of the stairwell. The darkness layered so tightly that it felt almost solid. "It's just the building," I whispered to myself, though the reassurance rang hollow even to my own ears. When I reached the top, the space widened into the bell chamber. It was a cramped room, just large enough to house the massive iron bell and the wooden support beams that framed it. Faded light filtered in through narrow slits in the walls, painting thin lines across the dust. The air was colder here than anywhere else in the church, so cold it bit at the tips of my fingers. I could see the bell clearly, its surface scarred with rust and age. But it was the rope that drew my gaze like a magnet. It dangled from the mechanism above, frayed and discolored, as I had been told. Up close, though, it carried new details I hadn't seen from below, sections where the accumulated dust was disturbed, places where the fibers had been recently compressed by gripping hands. I stepped closer until I could see them clearly. Faint, distinct marks on the rope. Not many, but enough. The kind of pattern fingers leave when they pull hard, when they strain. My heart knocked once against my ribs. The stranger in the archive had been tall, his hands large. These marks were too small, too narrow, ending too short along the rope length. Whoever had pulled this rope hadn't been a large man. Slowly, I reached out and laid my own fingers against the rope, matching them to the faint impressions left behind. My fingertips settled neatly into the dips. The fit was close. Too close. I pulled my hand back quickly, a shiver darting up my arm. It didn't make sense. I had not rung these bells. I remembered lying awake, counting, frozen in my bed. And yet, it was like the rope recognized the shape of me. I glanced down at the floor near the base of the mechanism. Dust lay thick across most of the boards, but not all. There were streaks, soft, partial, the kind that might be made by a shoe or a knee, or the hem of a garment dragging across the same path more than once. I crouched, steadying myself against one of the beams, and looked closer. Near the edge of the room, brushed into the dust like an unfinished thought, were the faintest impressions of fingers, small, slender, as if someone had braced themselves there. Pulling, holding, trying to manage the weight of the bell's voice alone, I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. "Who are you?" I asked the empty space, my voice barely more than a breath. No answer came, but something shifted in the air, so subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been listening with every part of myself. The cold deepened, wrapping more tightly around my arms. The tiny hairs on the back of my neck rose. It felt as though the room had grown more crowded, not with bodies, but with presence, like someone had stepped closer without making a sound. I stood slowly, my hand drifting instinctively to my pocket. The fabric scrap lay folded there, its embroidered initials pressing lightly against my fingertips. I took it out and unfolded it, holding it up in the dim light. The tiny stitches were precise, careful, almost loving. I thought of the erased name in the ledger, the angry ink scratch that had tried and failed to fully obscure it. The initials on the cloth and the letters beneath the ink's fury were one and the same. The person this town had tried to erase had once stood where I was standing now. I could feel it, like a memory pressing against my skin from the inside. I wet my lips and whispered the name. It felt strange in my mouth, unfamiliar yet heavy, as if it had been waiting a long time to be spoken again. The sound of it drifted upward into the beams and around the bell, fragile and thin, then dissolved. For a heartbeat nothing changed. Then the air shuddered just barely and the wooden frame of the tower groaned with a deep, low sound that traveled through my shoes and into my bones. It wasn't the sharp creak of settling timber. It was slower, more resonant, like the echo of a note played long ago finally reaching my ears. I stood perfectly still, listening. The tower felt full now, not empty. The space around me seemed to press inward and outward at the same time, like invisible attention turning toward me from all directions. The scrap of fabric fluttered in a draft I couldn't trace. The bell itself remained motionless, but I could almost hear in the back of my mind the memory of its voice, those 12 slow strikes that had dragged me out of sleep. "I hear you," I said quietly, scarcely daring to raise my voice above a whisper. "I don't know who you were, but I hear you." A faint tapping answered me from somewhere above, like the light brush of something against wood. It might have been a loosened piece of the mechanism, or a bird nesting where no one had checked in years. It might have been nothing at all, but as I stood there, the erased name still tingling on my tongue, I knew with a certainty that didn't come from logic that something or someone was trying desperately to be heard after all these years, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the bells had tried to say that night, they weren't finished. Not yet. The morning after the tower, the town felt thinner somehow, like someone had quietly removed a layer between me and everything else. Colors looked a little harsher, sounds a little sharper. Even the sky seemed to open, as if it had been listening to me whisper that erased name in the rafters and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. I walked through the streets with that name rolling silently in the back of my mind. The fabric scrap tucked deep into my pocket, the folded note pressed flat against my thigh. I knew I wouldn't find answers in books today, not the kind I was looking for. The records in the archive had already told me what they were allowed to say. The rest of the story lived in people, and people, especially old ones, had a way of remembering things they pretended to forget. I started with the one person I trusted most to give me an honest half-truth, Mr. Ellis. He was already at his usual table when I arrived at the library, a stack of history books arranged neatly in front of him. Outside, the morning light sliced across the windows in clean bands. Inside, dust drifted peacefully in soft currents. I made him tea without asking and brought it over, setting the cup down with a quiet clink. For a moment we sat in comfortable silence, the weight of unsaid things resting between us. Then I slid into the chair opposite his and placed the folded note on the table, careful to keep it mostly covered with my hand. My heart took on that uneven rhythm again. "Mr. Ellis," I said softly, "can I ask you something about the church? About a long time ago." His eyes lifted to mine, clear but tired. "Depends on the something," he said, but there was no real resistance in his voice. Just caution. I unfolded the note enough to reveal the list of names, letting his gaze fall over the faded ink, the careful calligraphy, the violent scratch that tore through one entry. His expression changed barely but enough. A brief tightening around his mouth, a slight shift in his shoulders. Recognition had a way of showing itself even when people tried to bury it. "You remember this name?" I asked quietly, tracing a careful circle around the damaged ink. "You don't have to say it. Just, do you remember them?" For a moment he didn't speak. The library seemed to lean inward. He sipped his tea, buying himself time, eyes resting not on the page but somewhere slightly beyond it, as if looking back through a window that wasn't there. "I remember a lot of names," he murmured. "Most of them don't matter much anymore." He hesitated. "Some of them still do. Does this one?" I pressed, my voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. "She was young," he said finally. "Younger than she should have had to be for what she carried. Clever, too clever for some folks' comfort. Had a way of seeing through things that were meant to stay opaque." His gaze flickered briefly to my face. "Spoke more than people wanted to hear. That was her trouble. And this town doesn't forgive trouble, even when it's telling the truth." The pronoun settled in my chest like a stone. "She," I had suspected, but hearing it said out loud made the air feel heavier. "What happened to her?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Depends who you ask. Some say she ran off. Some say she was sent away. Some don't say anything at all. Just close their mouths and their eyes and hope the memory dries up." His fingers tapped absently against his mug. "What I know is this: one day she was here, in that church, in this town, and the next day, she wasn't." He nodded toward the note. "And someone took a pen to her like that was enough to make her disappear." A quiet dread climbed through me, steady and cold. "Did my parents know her?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could soften it. Mer Ellis studied me for a moment. The lines on his face deepened not unkindly. Your parents were around, he said carefully. Everyone knew everyone back then. That's how it works here. You know that. He didn't answer the question directly, but he didn't have to. The silence around his words spoke just as clearly. I thanked him, though the word felt thin, and retreated back behind the front desk. The rest of the morning moved slowly, my tasks mechanical, my mind elsewhere. The erased name pulsed with a new kind of life now, no longer just ink on a page but a person with a sharp mind and a loud voice. Punished the same way I'd always been warned I would be if I didn't quiet down. The coincidence tasted too bitter to be coincidence at all. When my shift ended, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I walked toward the far edge of town, where the houses thinned and the oldest residents lived in places that had once been considered central before the town's main street shifted. I visited Mrs. Hughes first, an old widow whose porch always smelled faintly of lemon and medicine. She frowned when I mentioned the name, her fingers tightening around the arm of her chair. I don't remember, she said too quickly. Those days are a blur. But later, as I was leaving, she called after me with a softer voice. She used to sing, you know, loud as the bells. That was her problem. People say they like a good singer, but they don't. Not really, not when they have something to say. I thanked her and went to see Mr. Lambert next, a retired shopkeeper whose hands still moved as if counting coins. At first he pretended not to understand what name I was referring to, mishearing me twice, then asking if I was confusing her with someone else entirely. But when I mentioned the church records, his eyes darkened. You shouldn't be digging there, he muttered. Those pages were closed for a reason. When I pressed, he snapped. She made accusations she had no business making, then immediately softened, guilt flickering across his face. Or maybe she did have business. Depends who you ask. Either way, it didn't end well. This town doesn't like being pointed at. Their stories were fractured, but the shape beneath them was clear enough. A young woman had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, or refused to ignore something everyone else chose to. She had spoken, publicly, loudly, maybe from that very pulpit, maybe in front of people who had built their lives on being respected, and then she was gone. The details blurred, twisted, softened by time and fear and self-preservation, but the pattern remained: speak, suffer, disappear. The silence that followed had been well maintained. By early evening, I found myself sitting on a bench near the small park, the sun dipping low behind the trees, the air cooling around me in quiet layers. Children's laughter drifted faintly from a house nearby. Somewhere down the street, someone was grilling, the smell of smoke and meat mingling with the sweetness of cut grass. It was a peaceful scene on the surface, the kind every outsider might envy, but underneath it, I could feel the same tension that ran through the church walls and the old ledgers and my parents' smiles. A tension made of unspoken things. I took the fabric scrap from my pocket, unfolding it carefully in my lap. The embroidered initials stared up at me, delicate and persistent. This had belonged to her, the young woman everyone skirted around in their stories, the one whose name had been scratched out as if ink could dig her a grave. I imagined her sitting in that church, maybe in the front row, maybe in the choir loft, her voice carrying in a space that didn't know what to do with it. I imagined her seeing something she couldn't unsee, deciding to speak, and the town deciding that her existence was a problem easier to erase than to face. The realization settled over me slowly, like a blanket I hadn't realized I'd been wrapped in my entire life. I had been walking along the edge of her story without knowing it for years. Every time my parents told me not to embarrass them, not to make noise, not to correct anyone even when they were wrong. Every time the town called me sensitive, dramatic, too much. It wasn't just about me, it was about what had happened before, about what they were afraid might happen again. The bells, I realized, had not rung to warn anyone. They had not tolled as a threat or an omen. They had rung like a voice breaking through a sealed door, like a plea that had gone unanswered too long. They had rung for someone who had been silenced, and they had rung again for someone who was starting to remember how to listen. I looked up at the steeple in the distance, barely visible over the rooftops from where I sat. The light caught on its cross for a moment, a brief flash of dull gold. I felt that same pull in my chest, that quiet insistence that this wasn't just a mystery. It was a message, not just from the past, but to me. I didn't yet know exactly how I fit into this woman's story, only that I did. That my parents' fear, the town's avoidance, the scratched-out name, the fabric, the bells, they were all connected in a pattern I was only beginning to trace. What connected me to the woman who had disappeared? I didn't have the full answer yet. But as the sky darkened and the first street lights flickered on, one thing felt painfully, undeniably clear. Whatever it was, The town had spent decades trying to make sure I never found out. The decision to confront my parents came slowly, settling over me like a soft but persistent weight that refused to lift. By late afternoon, the sky had grayed over, the kind of muted light that makes every shadow feel heavier. I walked the familiar path to their house with steady steps, though my heartbeat fluttered like a trapped moth. In my pocket, the folded note and the fabric scrap pressed against my fingers with a quiet insistence. I wasn't going there to ask anymore. I was going to tell them what I knew. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes in an old rhythm, one I had followed countless times. But today each step felt like walking toward the edge of a truth I could no longer ignore. Inside, the house carried its usual scent of lemon polish and lightly toasted bread. My mother stood at the counter slicing apples, her expression calm until she saw my face. My father sat at the table sorting through bills, his glasses low on his nose, the quiet authority he wore like a second skin resting comfortably in his posture. Neither of them spoke at first. I felt the air tighten between us, the same invisible barrier that had always kept certain words from crossing the room. I drew in a breath, steadying myself against the familiar ache rising in my chest. For the first time in a long while, I didn't push the feeling down. "I need to talk to you both," I said, my voice low but clear. My father looked up slowly, and my mother set down the knife, wiping her hands on a towel with careful motions. I pulled the note from my pocket and unfolded it on the table, smoothing its creases with trembling fingers. Next to it, I placed the scrap of fabric. The initials faced upward, small and precise. My parents stared at the objects as if they were something dangerous. "I know about her," I said quietly. "The woman who disappeared. The one the town erased." I met my father's eyes. "The one you erased from our family." My mother's face went still, a stiffness spreading beneath her polite expression like frost forming across glass. My father pushed his chair back and stood, not abruptly but with deliberation, as though bracing himself against a blow he had long expected. He didn't deny it, not immediately. Instead, he picked up the fabric scrap with a careful pinch of his fingers, turning it over once before setting it back down. His sigh was long and tired, the kind that carried years inside it. "She wasn't erased," he said finally, though even he didn't seem to believe it. "She left, that's all." "No," I replied, feeling strength collect inside me like warm breath on cold glass. "She didn't just leave. People don't get scratched out of records because they moved away. Someone wanted her gone." I pointed to the violent ink stroke on the roster. "Someone wanted her forgotten." My mother sank into the chair beside me, her hands twisting together in her lap. Her shoulders shook faintly, not with crying, but with the effort of holding something in. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "She was my sister," she said. "Your aunt." Her name was Leora. The name settled into my bones like a sudden echo of something I had known without knowing. I swallowed, the air growing thick in my throat. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked. "Why hide her?" My mother closed her eyes for a long moment, as if seeing something painful behind them. "She was difficult," she said softly. "She was brave in ways that scared people. She saw things and said things she wasn't supposed to. She challenged people who weren't used to being challenged." She lifted her gaze to mine. "She accused someone important, someone the town trusted. And when she refused to stay quiet about it, everything fell apart." My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. My mother's voice shook slightly as she continued. "We begged her to stop, not because she was wrong, but because we knew what this town does to people who make noise." A tremor crossed her face. "When the church bells rang that night, it was the last sound we heard from her. They say she ran. Others believe she was taken, but no one ever saw her again. And the town," she swallowed. "The town chose the version that was easiest." I felt the weight of her words gather in the air around us. Suddenly everything fit. My parents' fear of attention, their warnings, their insistence on silence, their discomfort whenever I raised my voice, even gently. It wasn't about me, it was about her, about the ghost of their shame, and their terror that history might repeat itself through me. "She was punished for telling the truth," I said, "and you're afraid the same thing will happen to me." My father finally spoke, his voice rough in a way I had never heard. "You don't understand what it cost us," he said. "This town doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive people who disrupt its peace." Leora opened a wound no one wanted to admit existed. "We lost her because of it. We couldn't lose you too." A cold, aching clarity settled inside me. "So you chose silence," I said, "even if it meant erasing her, even if it meant silencing me too." My mother reached for my hand with trembling fingers. "We thought we were protecting you. We thought silence was safer." The painful tenderness of her touch traveled up my arm. But the truth inside me had already sharpened. Silence isn't safety, I said softly. Silence is a cage. For a moment the three of us sat in a suspended stillness, the past pressing against the walls, the present holding its breath. Outside, a bird called once, a long, lonely sound that faded into the dimming evening. I folded the note and the scrap of fabric and held them in my palm, feeling their fragile weight. The bells didn't ring to warn me, I said quietly. They rang for her. They rang because someone wanted to be heard again. My mother's eyes filled with a desperate fear. Please, Mara, don't go any further. Let the past stay buried. But for the first time in my life, I felt something deeper than fear, a calm clarity settling into place, steady and certain. I can't, I said. Not anymore. I've been quiet my whole life. And it hasn't protected anyone, not her. Not me. My father's shoulders slumped, as if he understood something he'd been resisting for years. The house felt too small, the walls too close, but my breath felt fuller than it ever had. I stood, holding the evidence of a story they tried to protect me from. And as I walked toward the door, the truth followed me like a steady light. If silence had a cost, I was finally ready to stop paying it. The night I chose to return to the bell tower, the valley felt unnaturally still, as if the earth itself were pausing to listen. A faint silver moon hung low above the hills, washing the rooftops in a quiet, hesitant glow. I walked with a steadiness I didn't entirely recognize, a calm anchored deep in my chest. The truth about Leora, my aunt, my mirror, my warning moved with me like a second heartbeat. Each step up the hill felt deliberate, each breath clearing away another layer of the silence I had inherited. When I finally reached the church steps, the air brushed cold against my arms, not with the sharpness of fear but with the coolness of something waiting to be settled. The church doors opened easily beneath my hands, the hinges groaning in their familiar tired way. Inside, the sanctuary lay in half darkness, the last strands of moonlight drifting through the stained glass in muted blues and greens. The air held its usual chill, but tonight it felt less oppressive, less like a clenched fist and more like a deep inhale. I walked the aisle slowly, my footsteps echoing softly through the cavernous space. With each step I felt the echo of Leora's story, the warnings she ignored, the accusations she made, the bell rope she pulled before disappearing. Shame had silenced the town, fear had silenced my family, but the bells had never been hers alone. They had been meant for anyone willing to listen. The narrow door to the tower groaned as I pushed it open, revealing the steep staircase curling upward in the shadows. I gripped the rail and began to climb, the wood creaking beneath each footfall. Dust drifted lazily through the narrow shaft of moonlight filtering from above. The cold deepened as I ascended, wrapping around me gently, like a presence rather than an emptiness. By the time I reached the top, the air felt different, dense, aware, almost warm despite the chill. The bell chamber greeted me like an old memory. The massive bell towered over the space, its rusted surface glowing faintly under the slivers of moonlight cutting through the wooden slats. And there, hanging from the mechanism, was the rope, frayed, worn, touched by hands that had disappeared into history. I stepped closer, letting my fingers brush lightly over the fibers. They felt rough but familiar, as though they carried a trace of all the hands that had gripped them before mine. When I curled my fingers around the rope, a soft tremor ran through me, not fear but recognition. I thought of Leora standing where I stood now, speaking truths no one wanted to hear, her voice echoing against walls determined to contain it. I thought of the bells she rang, the sound that rippled across the valley as her final defiance. She had been alone then. I wasn't. Her story lived in the space around me, in the town below, in the threads I had pulled loose until the entire history had begun to unravel. The rope felt lighter somehow, as if it were waiting not for strength but intention. With a slow exhale I pulled. The first movement felt small, almost hesitant, but the second pull carried more weight, and the rope responded with a low groaning vibration that traveled through my arms and into my chest. The bell stirred above me, shifting with a deep, ancient reluctance, as though waking from a long and troubled sleep. When the sound finally broke free, it rang out in one long, resonant note that filled the chamber and spilled into the night outside. The vibration trembled through the floorboards, up the beams, out into the valley. It was a sound that belonged to no single person, not Leora, not me, something larger, something unburied. I pulled again, and the bell's second cry rolled over the rooftops, echoing off the distant hills. Lights flicked on in houses below, small glimmers of yellow breaking through the darkness as curtains shifted and doors opened. The town was listening now. The sound carried every truth it had tried to hide, every voice it had pressed down, every shame it had refused to acknowledge. I felt my breath steady as I pulled a third time. The bell rang louder, fuller, freer than I had ever heard it. This time, I felt something inside me loosen some knot I had carried for years. Formed by my parents' cautions, by my own swallowed words, by the ghost of a woman whose voice had been taken from her, I let the bell's final note fade before releasing the rope. My hands trembling not from effort but from the profound lightness blooming in my chest. The air around me felt changed, no longer crowded with the weight of the past, but open, almost gentle. I stood in the quiet, listening to the subtle creaks of the tower settling back into stillness. When I stepped toward the narrow slatted window, I looked out over the valley bathed in moonlight. Small clusters of people stood outside their homes, gazing toward the steeple with a mixture of confusion, unease, and something else, acknowledgement. They couldn't pretend anymore. The sound had reached every corner of their silence. Descending the stairs felt easier than climbing them. The air grew warmer with each step, and by the time I reached the sanctuary floor, the tension that had always lived there seemed to have thinned. I walked down the aisle slowly, feeling the echo of the bells hum quietly beneath my ribs. When I stepped outside, the night wrapped around me in a soft, cool breeze. The town was still waking to the truth it had buried. Windows remained cracked open, porch lights glowed brighter, and shadows shifted with hesitant curiosity. Change wasn't loud. It was a murmur, a beginning. I walked down the hill with steady steps, feeling something inside me settle into place, something that felt like ownership of my own voice. Leora's story wasn't finished in silence, and neither was mine. The bells had carried her final plea across decades, and tonight, they had carried mine. When the valley finally returned to stillness, it was not the fragile, fearful silence I had known all my life. It was a silence with room to breathe, a silence born not from suppression, but from release. And as I reached the bottom of the hill, the question drifted through me with quiet certainty. Now that my voice had found its echo, where would it lead me next?